evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 99 of the Retrospectives podcast, Metroid Prime. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, James Sterling. James, were you surprised to hear that I wanted to do Metroid Prime, that I'm the one who picked this game? I know this is a game that you have some experience with, seeing as you owned a GameCube.
I didn't own a GameCube. What are you saying?
Oh, you owned a Wii, which could also play these games? I'm a bit fuzzy on that whole line of consoles.
So, I've actually tried to play Metroid Prime 3 times prior to this episode. I own the trilogy re-release on Wii U, actually. And every single time I have dropped it about an hour in and gotten bored. So it was pretty interesting actually seeing the rest of the game this fortnight, I gotta say.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel about Metroidvanias in general? I know that despite my constant pestering, I can't seem to get you to get very far with Hollow Knight. From memory, you really enjoyed Castlevania, but you were much lower when we covered Super Metroid. How are your feelings on the whole on the genre? And is there a particular one that you've enjoyed above and beyond those two?
I think it has to do with rewards and exploration. I reckon the reason I liked Castlevania Symphony of the Night and not those other games was because Castlevania was filled to the brim with weird shit to find in every nook and cranny, whereas Super Metroid, it's like, oh, you found another missile pod. This is the 30th one. Isn't that exciting? And Hollow Knight had... it had stuff, but the badges felt a bit limiting to me. Like, it was like there was a very small subset of curated items, and it was mostly you finding money and stuff and then buying the items at shops. So
yeah, Hollow Knight had a lot of unique rewards, but it gives them to you slowly. Like, that game is like a 30 to 40 hour game, so it kind of spreads the experience over that 30 to 40 hours, whereas your Super Metroids and your Castlevanias are much shorter games, so you kind of get stuff thrown at you at a far faster pace. But Hollow Knight eventually does have, quite good customization. But I can understand if you haven't played very far, not really seeing the full benefit of that.
I do think I like the genre. I just think I have very specific things that I want out of it that not all of them give me, basically.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see if Metroid Prime fulfills that category. Because we're going to be talking about it. James and I have played it over the past fortnight, and that's what we do here on the Retrospectives podcast. We play these classic or niche, under-regarded or highly regarded titles of the past with the intent of discovering just how good these games are to play today. We're not interested in how good these games were at the time in which they were released. We just want to know, is it worth your time in amongst everything that gets released, movies, games, books, you name it, to play a game that's 20 plus years old, like Metroid Prime? And this one is one that's insanely high regarded. So it's going to be very interesting, this discussion. I'm looking forward to it. We should talk a little bit of what Metroid Prime is and how we played it, because Metroid Prime, for those who haven't heard of it, it's a first-person action adventure and surprise, Metroidvania. It does belong to that broader Metroidvania label.
I resent calling Metroid a Metroidvania.
I know.
I just want that to be on the record. It sounds so wrong.
You can resent it as much as you like. That's what the genre is called. Even if it could just be called a Metroidvania or a Metroid-like.
A game in the Metroid series.
I think the thing that is obviously special about Metroid Prime, when you look at it in the broader series, is it's the first one to be 3D. It's the fifth game in the series, but yeah, it's the first in 3D, and it joins a very eclectic group of 3D Metroidvanias because it's kind of a rare genre, and that's something I want to jump into in just a moment, James. In these games, you reprise the role of Samus. She's responding to a distress signal, only to find a devastated pirate ship orbiting a Chozo homeworld. And pirate has a specific meaning in the Metroid universe. The pirates are a faction. They're not just generic unnamed pirates.
I think it's unclear, actually. I think it's supposed to be vague whether they are a faction or like a race.
Oh, okay, sure. To me, they seemed very organized, at least from the lore I was watching. So I at the very least, they're very open to genetic engineering. So they've probably broken the barriers on what race is for them at the very least. They seem to be very diverse in their
I think that's the idea. There's lots of them that look completely different, but in their logs and stuff, they do mention that they will do anything to change their physiology for, their species advancement or whatever. But
they're referred to as pirates, but they're not like Pirates of the Caribbean. This is an organized, technological, sophisticated faction at the very least. So you board this pirate ship where shit has gone down. You encounter an alien on it, ended up blowing up the ship. It falls to this planet, Talon 4, and you see the recently mechanized Ripley, who's one of the Metroid series. Ridley, sorry, not Ripley. Ridley fly to the surface, and you follow him to the surface. While you're down there, you discover a shrine, and the shrine talks of a poison at the heart of the planet, sealed with the only way to get there to collect these 12 artifacts. So, over the course of the game, what you do is you platform your way through Talon 4, you gain new abilities, which gives you access to new areas, you kill a bunch of native wildlife, you obliterate pirates, and eventually you try to collect those 12 artifacts so that you can confront this poison at the heart of the planet. So that's the basic setup for Super Metroid, and we will get into the story in just a second. But before we do any of that, it's time to talk about how we played this game, because we took a pretty different approach, didn't we, James? We didn't just emulate the GameCube or Wii version, we did something slightly more advanced.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the fortnight, now 3 weeks, now 4 weeks, I was going to play on my copy on the Wii U and then could not be bothered plugging it in. So ended up emulating it using Prime Hack, which is a fork of Dolphin specifically designed with Metroid Prime in mind. And like historically, this game has ran pretty poorly on emulators. I know a long time ago I tried myself. And it ran terribly. The sound was cutting out constantly. It was jittery. It was very strange. Luckily for us, some very dedicated fellows have put together this wonderful, hack that lets you play the game almost flawlessly in, any resolution of your choosing with mouse and keyboard input. And that's how we did it for this, this cycle.
Yeah, and I want to thank our Discord user Mayday Mima for bringing this to my attention, because I think it made the experience far more enjoyable for me. As is well known, I like using mouse and keyboard for shooters, and this one is no exception. Particularly since the original game has a kind of weird control scheme. It isn't your typical, one stick moves the camera, the other one moves your direction. It's like half tank controls. I don't know if you've played much with that kind of control scheme games, but it seemed really awkward when I first jumped in the game and tried it out.
I didn't actually give it a go. I probably should have.
Yeah, it's very strange, and I think it's why the lock-on is such an important part of the game, because without that lock-on, I don't think the game would really be playable with the original control scheme.
Yeah, probably not. This did make the game a lot easier. I have to say, with mouse and keyboard, but man, it felt really good to play because of it.
Made the game more enjoyable. So yeah, I fully endorse using Prime Hack. Even stuff as simple as the widened field of view just do wonders. So if you're going to play this game today, I absolutely think that you should use this branch of Dolphin.
And I personally would argue that I don't think that this game is one that really benefits from being more difficult, I guess. So I don't really think that it's too much of a downside to do it this way. It just feels better and is more fun. So, that's why we're playing it to begin with.
Yeah, this isn't a game where challenge is one of its core concepts. So I agree with that, James. Final thing I wanted to get into, just a big picture concept, I think. 3D Metroidvanias, this entire genre, is shockingly rare. Like, 2D Metroidvanias, particularly nowadays, ever since indie gaming really took off, are a dime a dozen. There are so many of them. There are not an endless number of good ones, but there are craploads of them. True 3D Metroidvanias are very infrequent. So I wanted to just ask you, James, do you have any idea why this might be? Why games like Metroid Prime seem to be almost unique in their execution? Or do you think that the uniqueness of Metroid Prime is overstated and that there are plenty of other games that dabble in this 3D Metroidvania design than I can think of?
I don't think that there's anything stopping them from existing, really. Both of us have played the game Supraland, which is a 3D Metroidvania, essentially.
Heavy
It's a
puzzle
game,
emphasis.
yeah, heavy puzzle emphasis. Everything's gated on items and abilities. I think that stuff like the 3D Zelda games are like almost, the same as this, but I think they're a bit more linear, in their story progression. But they're essentially 3D games that are gated by item progression in many ways. I don't think like Breath of the Wild kind of counts because you don't really need items to progress because it's trying to go for a much more open, but definitely like the N64 Zelda games, specifically like mid game and Ocarina of Time, where you can kind of do things in a different order, definitely feels like it's hitting the same notes. I think it's a lot easier, and we're going to get onto this later, to keep the map in your head when it's in 2D and there isn't a third axis of movement.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really see any real reason for them being as sparse as they are, to be honest.
It's kind of annoying because when I looked at games that when I typed in 3D Metroidvanias into Google, it was like a greatest list hit of some of my favorite games. Like Supraland, I love to pieces. That game is massively underrated. One of the best puzzle games in recent years, not in terms of the tightness of its design, but just in terms of how fun it is. Antichamber and Outer Wilds are also open world Metroid-ish games where knowledge is the thing that's gating your progress of that game. It's an interesting spin. Of course, we can't go without mentioning Resident Evil and Dark Souls, which, although they don't have movement abilities, still have looping 3D level design where finding keys or levers lets you unlock things. And Prey is probably the best example of a game that I can think of being similar to Super Metroid.
This genre definition is getting bigger and bigger.
It is, yeah. It's tricky. I guess when I think of these open world in inverted commas, because they're not open world like Assassin's Creed is. It's more like you get dropped into a location with lots of potential areas to go, and you get to open up those areas with movement abilities. Like Metroid Prime is almost, in terms of everything it does, it's kind of unique. Like I don't think there's any game that's really quite like this one. It's just interesting, particularly when it's so highly regarded, that we haven't seen more attempts to replicate what Metroid Prime is doing. And just a question, I guess, to the broader audience as well: why haven't we seen more games like Metroid Prime? It's an interesting question when it was so successful. James, let's go to story. So I've briefly introduced the baseline story of Metroid Prime, but I think it's worth talking about how the story is delivered to the player and how you kind of get bits and pieces of the story as you're playing through the game.
So, do you want to talk about the story or the presentation of the story?
I think those are very interlinked, I guess, in my mind.
So, well, let's start with the presentation, right? Because I remember very distinctly when we did Super Metroid, I thought that the direction of the storytelling, that there was no, voice or written dialogue whatsoever, and it was entirely environmental and visual. There was nothing else other than visual to tell you what was going on in the plot. I thought that direction was great, and I liked the idea. I thought that there wasn't enough of it, and that because there wasn't enough of it, what was there was great. Like the bit with the animals teaching you special moves, that was like 10 out of 10 best thing ever. And some of the like little lore bits here and there were great. That just wasn't enough. Metroid Prime has actually gone in the opposite direction, where now you have the ability to put on your scan visor and scan most objects in the environment, and a text box will appear with like a bit of information or some lore or something like that. There's logs from alien races that detail the history of the planet, that kind of thing. It's a much more direct and in-your-face approach.
Well, I wouldn't say direct and in your face, because the scanning of things is optional. This isn't like the game bombarding. In fact, it's still pretty subtle compared to how video games mostly do things nowadays.
Yeah, I agree on the scale of like video games as a whole. It's still subdued, but compared to Super Metroid, it's more in your
Yeah,
face.
sure, but I'd say that in most games. But I just want to emphasize this is a game without dialogue. Like Samus
Yeah,
doesn't talk to anyone at any point throughout this entire game. The
yeah,
entire story is delivered to you through, as you said, scanning and reading. And it's not just logs that you're scanning and reading. You're scanning the native wildlife of the planet and the enemies and other bits and pieces. It kind of builds a complete picture by scanning literally everything, which is what I was doing because I enjoyed reading about the world.
that's interesting. I hate the scan, actually, like with a
Really? Oh,
burning
so that's
passion.
so interesting
Yes.
because this topic, when we covered Super Metroid, and Super Metroid is going to be a returning point for us because these games are startlingly similar despite the change from 2D to 3D. You definitely said something about, man, I wish this game had something like scanning so that I could get a bit more detail about the environment. You tell us why. Tell us why.
I don't hate the idea as a concept, and I actually do think that there are a number of scan points in the game that are great. Like, specifically, I think all of the history of the world regarding the Chozo and all of that is great. Specifically, I think there are too many scan points that offer nothing of value, basically.
Hmm.
Specifically in the tutorial at the beginning of the game, because as I mentioned before, I've started this game about 3 separate times before now and not gotten past the first hour. And this time going through, I identified that the scan is the reason why, I think, because the tutorial level of this game is stuffed to the brim with scan points. And I, like, even now, even though I've gone through that tutorial like 3 times, I still felt the need to scan everything just in case I missed something important.
Mm.
And 99% of the stuff in the tutorial is useless. It's like there's a crate and it says, like, this is crate 1356. And there's like 10 of those crates, and there's like, this goo looks suspicious. Like, it's all very, the text is very cardboardy and flat. Like,
Mhm.
there's no personality behind like 99% of the dialogue in this game, other than the Chozo lore bits. And this one data log in one of the science facilities where the pirates are like, man, we've managed to copy every single one of Samus's weapons except the morph ball, which has ended in disaster every single time a pirate has tried to, like, shrink themselves. That was like the one funny one in the whole game. But the tutorial specifically has, like, it'll take you like 3 times longer to beat the tutorial if you scan everything, and that's what I did. And I don't think there was a single scan point in there that was worth like value at all.
Well, I mean, you get now. I'm not going to defend the tutorial scanning because I agree with you. There's a lot of redundant information, but you get to that room where you can see that the pirates are doing genetic experiments on the native wildlife, and to me that was interesting because it kind of gave me an idea to the nature of what the pirates were doing on the planet, while also introducing the concept of phazon as an energy source and so on and
Yep.
so forth. So
You can do that
I
visually though, right?
you can do it visually, but I mean, having a bit about, okay, here's the 4 stages of the experiments we're doing on
Yeah.
these things, is having brief text logs. I think is a fine way to do it. And my favorite areas in the entire game were the 2 pirate bases from a storytelling, particularly the research lab. I thought was really good. You kind of got to see all the weird experiments that they were trying on both the native wildlife and pirates to kind of transform them and make them more powerful. So yeah, while I think that I agree that the tutorial has some redundant information, I definitely disagree with you on a big picture perspective. I really liked the scanning, and I liked reading about all of these things, both the more spiritual Chozo and their prophecy and how they kind of withdrew as a species. We were able to get a very clear contrast between the Chozo as a race and these pirates as a race or faction, because the Chozo were more spiritual and, they literally got rid of a lot of that technology to live a simpler life. And then you have the pirates who are technologically advanced and they're very organized. They're seemingly competent, and they want to exploit the poison, the phazon for their own ends. They want to use it for energy. They want to develop bioweapons. They want to, do mutations. They're performing organized experiments. They've got a clear hierarchy, like a military hierarchy where people are following orders and scouting the area and so on and so forth. And I really like this idea of having the Chozo and all their ruins and everything, and then learning about the pirates kind of started abusing this planet for their own ends. So yeah, the pirates scan points were a lot more informative and drier, but that's because they were conducting scientific experiments. It should be a bit drier and with less personality, right?
Yeah, I kind of agree. I guess it's just a problem for me at the start because, like, later on, like
Sure.
the stuff with the soldiers is interesting, but at the very beginning of the game, it's like these pirates are using this magical sci-fi substance to become more powerful. It's
Unobtainium,
like,
right?
yeah. It's a bit, it's very simple at the start, and lots of stories are like that, and they get more interesting as they go. And I do agree it did. Like the Chozo are great. Like I like because to me, like Metroid's atmosphere, both in Super Metroid and this one, it's kind of like lonely desolation, I guess is
Hmm.
how I describe it. And having this race, this logs about this race that they basically went extinct, right? Because of this thing hit the planet and was destroying everything, and they could have left the planet, but they chose to stay to try and do what they could to preserve the wildlife, because that's the big contrast between them and the pirates, right? The pirates are very self-motivated, very selfish kind of people, whereas the Chozo were more like, they care about their planet and all the other things that live there, right? So to me, it kind of endeared me to that race because they're like, they're going to go extinct if they don't leave, but they're doing the right thing by, the other species, I guess.
You
So
should really play Outer Wilds, James, because this whole concept, it kind of reminds me a lot of that game, because you have the
yeah.
super intelligent species. The difference with the one in Outer Wilds is that the characters who are leaving the data logs have personalities, and they're giant science nerds, and they're telling science nerd jokes constantly in all of the things that you scan. So yeah, I was definitely reminded of them. But yeah, I think that while this story is relatively simple, I think that the way it was able to get across the personalities of these two races and the way they were layered on top of one another, it kind of reminded me of the mission from Thief 2 at the lighthouse, where you've got all of the logs
mm,
and stories about, the pirates are
yeah.
coming to the cove, and then the mechanists have built this secret submarine base on top of it. That's what this reminded me of. You've got this base, these Chozo ruins, and then the pirates have swooped in and they've built a bunch of technology and platforms and research stations in and around the ruins to the best of their ability. So yeah, I really like this story. I thought that the way it was delivered was great, and I enjoyed the scanning a lot. I liked how minimalist it was.
I like what it's trying to convey. I like this idea of this tragic backstory of this planet and all of that. And then with Super Metroid, it's like I don't care about what it's trying to tell me, but I like the way it's trying to tell me the stuff I don't care about. You know what I mean? It's like they're both like not giving me what I want entirely.
Yeah, and to be completely honest, the pirates could have a bit more nuance to them. They're just evil guys. Like they're I would have liked to hear the good side of the pirates. Like being technologically advanced and wanting to use a resource for energy is not intrinsically evil. But the pirates are just seem intrinsically
Intrinsically,
evil
yeah,
with
I
no
mean,
redeeming qualities. And I think that leads to a less interesting story because of it, compared to, what the mechanists were doing in Thief 2, for example.
yeah, all ages Nintendo games kind of going to be like that,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
and
But
but it's worth noting. I liked the contrast between these two factions and how they were layered. So I like the story of this game. So I think good job.
the second part, actually, I have a little follow up to the scanning thing that I
Mhm.
didn't like about it. Was that something that's really enjoyable in games is that when you encounter a new enemy, you need to figure out the best way to tackle that enemy. And you'll do a bit of trial and error, trying a few different strategies until you settle on one that works. in Metroid Prime, you encounter a new enemy, you scan it, and it tells you exactly how to beat it.
Yeah.
It was
Also, the bosses, it's actually embarrassing sometimes how it tells you exactly what to do.
exactly what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think this is a flaw, as we said, an all ages Nintendo game, right? Like, you know, this is for everyone, right? And that kind of helps. But to me specifically, I think that takes away from the game part of the game, like the gameplay part of the game. Like that trial and error process of figuring things out is part of what makes the game fun. So for it to just give that to you,
It's way too obvious. I think a big part of the problem is that sorry, go on.
I think I would just recommend people, like, you can just not do that, right? Like,
Yep.
if you listen to our episode and then you go and play Metroid Prime, just if you care about that, just don't scan the enemies, just scan everything else, right?
I think the real problem here is that fighting enemies and combat in this game isn't intrinsically enjoyable. Like, if you're playing Halo 1, fighting the enemies and going for headshots and so on, and figuring out your movement and throwing grenades, it's fun intrinsically. Like, you enjoy doing it. So, if the game told you, oh, to beat elites, you need to shoot your plasma pistol at full, and then it drops their shield and you still headshot them, that doesn't ruin your enjoyment because it's so fun to actually play the video game.
Right.
In this game, the figuring out is the fun bit. So if scanning figures it out for you, then you've kind of gotten rid of the most fun bit of the combat experience completely.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I think that there was a way to do this where it was more subtle, like without it actually explicitly spelling out how to beat the enemy exactly.
Yeah, I don't know if there's enough, like, nuance to the combat. Like, even if they say something like, you know, this monster lives in an arid environment and doesn't like the cold. You know, like, it's like, can you be more subtle than that?
Yeah,
like,
that's
at
true.
that point, it's a bit difficult when it's so limited.
Well, also, most of the time, it's just like this enemy is weak to attack X, or this enemy has weak spot X. So I agree that it just doesn't really lend itself to deep and nuanced combat.
Yeah, so, well, I want to talk a bit about the combat, because I kind of agree with you that it's a low point of this game, but let's quickly talk a bit about the music and go for a quick music break. 30 minutes in. So when we did Super Metroid, I think one of the things we said was that the music that was there was good. There just wasn't enough of it, and it didn't play very often. Was that? Am I misremembering?
Basically, my feeling about Super Metroid music is that I would struggle to call it bad, because it's not bad. It does suit the atmosphere, but it's incredibly understated. And this is coming from ambient droning #1 fan. I think that at times it just wasn't enough of it. Like, it was just so slow and steady that it didn't immerse me as much. I had a few favorite tracks. Bryn Star is one of my favorite, but I think it was too little music, if anything. I think Metroid Prime is bloody nails it. I really love the soundtrack, and I think that it does a lot to set the atmosphere. Each and every stage and area has unique music that suits the area perfectly, from the volcanic caverns to the icy Fendara drifts. It's really wonderful. Introducing kind of like synthetic noises into this and kind of layering that over the more understated feeling of Super Metroid was an inspired choice. They just go hand in hand, and I feel like to me it sounds like an enhanced version of Super Metroid's soundtrack.
Yeah, a lot of the tracks are, you know, the same track, just remastered, basically. And I think they did a good job with that. I would say that the soundtrack ranges from fine to good to great. Like, there are no bad songs on the soundtrack. There are some really fantastic ones, like the one that replaces the Talon Overworld theme when you get about halfway through the game. That's like a 10 out of 10 track. The music that starts playing when you get into the submerged wreckage, that is like a 10 out of 10 track. And I really like the Fenendra Drift soundtrack as well. I think that there's a lot of good music, and then there's like one or two that are like, they're okay.
I didn't like the combat music very much. I found that mainly because a part of that is towards the end of the game, I was actively skipping combat. I was just jumping through, and it keeps dropping in over the good music. You're like, why can't this just be more peaceful?
Yeah, it's like the best part of the game is the atmosphere and the immersion and like
Yeah.
the slow exploration. I strongly think that every time there was combat, it made the game worse.
When
Like,
you're in those like the Chozo ruins, and there are no enemies, you really get to have that soundtrack sink in. It's the other reason why the Sunken Frigate is so good, because the combat encounters there's far fewer of them. But yeah, on the whole, like awesome soundtrack. Loved it, and I think that in a lot of ways this will be how you remembered Super Metroid soundtrack.
absolutely. Well, we were talking about the songs to play, and then I went back and I looked at the songs we picked from Super Metroid and was like, we're just going to pick basically the same songs again. And that probably is true. Well, I'm going to pick the Talon Overworld Depths theme because it's by far, well, at least to me, by far the best track in the game,
Mhm.
and by far the most atmospheric. So this is Talon Overworld Depths. Right, let's go to combat, Patrick. We've been alluding to it a bit. I think it sucks. Basically, I think it's really bad. I skipped as much of it as I could. Basically,
So I guess the first thing I want to distinguish is the combat against the pirates versus the combat against the alien
Or-
wildlife, and
yep,
also the combat when it's part of the platforming, which I think is distinct. We're talking purely about combat, killing enemies for the sake of killing enemies here, right? Not shooting
yep,
an enemy so we can clear a platform temporarily, right?
yes,
Yeah.
basically.
And the answer is yes, it's bad. I think we do need to acknowledge that we're playing with a control scheme.
That makes it very easy.
It makes it
Yes.
very easy. And my way to kind of balance this out was that I didn't use the lock on function nearly as much. I tried to free aim things as much as possible. Were you doing that, or were you using the lock on function a lot?
I did it a tiny bit at the start, and then was like, I don't know. I still didn't find it very engaging, so I just did that to get it over with as fast as I could generally. And then a few hours in, I just started like ignoring the enemies because you get
A million
like
health.
you get so much health that like you can just stand there for like half an hour and not take your hands off the keyboard and you won't die.
Yeah, so
It's
to give you a
nuts.
basic idea of the combat, you have a beam rifle. This gets supplemented with other weapons: an ice beam, a wave beam, and a plasma beam or fire beam. You can charge these weapons up for a more powerful attack, and you also have missiles. Eventually, you can also power up the other weapons, but it's not really... You're not going to be doing that for most of the video game. Most of the time, you have 2 to 3 different weapons that you can charge up in missiles. This isn't a cover-based shooter. Like, you can duck into cover a little bit, but it's closer to Halo in that regard, where it's better to make more decisive movements. But the enemy AI is completely brain dead, and it will generally die in 1 or 2 charged hits. So generally what you do is you charge up, kill one enemy, then charge up and kill the next, while trying to like double jump and move around to avoid enemy fire. But it's nothing deliberate. This isn't like Doom, where you have revenant rockets tracking you and you have to have precise movement to avoid taking damage or you die. You just kind of jump around aimlessly while shooting guns at enemies. You take some collateral damage because it's impossible to avoid completely. Everything dies, and then you move on to the next enemy. It's pretty brain dead, uninspired stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. Like at the very start of the game, it shows a bit of promise. Like there's a couple of enemies they introduced that require you to like kind of like circle strafe them and hit them in the back to kill them. And at this point in the game, you're like, oh, I guess they'll keep introducing new enemies with new like gimmicks that I need to deal with. And then there's a long stretch of the game where you do just shoot at them and don't do anything special to kill enemies. And then you get the ice beam, at which point almost every enemy dies in ice shot missile. And then you get to the end of the game and they start introducing color-coded enemies. So there's a red enemy that you can only deal damage with fire. And, there's a white enemy that you can only deal damage with ice, and they have lots of health, take a while to kill. And at that point, I just started running past them because I think a big part of the problem is that there is, like, no reason to kill them at all. Like, they don't stop you from getting through the areas. And generally, like, killing them costs you more resources than you gain from them, what they drop.
Yeah, they chip your health. Like, it's just annoying. There's not really a way to get through these encounters without taking some damage.
Yeah, it's like, it's very tedious and time-consuming. They're not intrinsically fun to fight. Like Doom, like you mentioned, has like a bunch of enemies and the different configurations are interesting. All of, like, basically every configuration of enemies in Metroid Prime is exactly the same. Like, you...
Maybe it's like 3 at once. Like, it's not like you're fighting off 15 enemies at once, like in Halo. The encounter places you're fighting them, it tends to be like short to medium range, small rooms. Yeah, so you're not even getting much variety in terms of combat geography. James, how did you feel the first time you properly encountered the pirates when you go into the research station? Because when I first went in there, I was like, okay, this is kind of interesting. These enemies are very aggressive. They're chasing me around in melee combat. Did you feel that first encounter with those enemies was more interesting, or were you just out of it from the start?
Yeah, it was okay, I guess. Like, I just super missiled each of them, and then, like, they died to one super missile, I think.
As does do most things in the game.
Yeah, and then kept going. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't really like those. I thought the ghosts were, like, kind of enjoyable the very first time, and then they were annoying. One of the things I mentioned all the way back in episode 2 of this show in Banjo-Kazooie was that I think that game is better because the enemies are trivially easy to kill. Like, they die in literally one hit, and they don't impede your progress too much. The late game of Metroid Prime became a bit of a slog to me because the enemies became tankier, and because the enemies, like, in the areas that you had already been to and cleared, like at the very start of the game, the enemies upgrade, and now those areas that used to have easy enemies have these annoying tanky pirates that, this isn't an RPG, you're not getting experience for killing them, you're getting, like, literally nothing, not even fun from killing these things.
And it's worth noting, because we haven't before, enemies respawn. Whenever you return to an area, the enemies are back every single time.
There is a delay. Like, if you go back and forth through a door, they don't respond.
Yeah, but it's not like, quite that fast, but it's pretty quickly.
Yeah, if you get a few rooms away and then come back, they'll be there again.
Which is a
good
standard
thing.
Well, it's part of what... I mean, it happens in every Metroidvania in existence, the 2D ones and the 3D ones. I mean, hell, it happens in Dark Souls, of course. But if the combat encounters, as you said, are not engaging, they're not rewarding, like you're not getting anything tangible out of them, and they're not necessary to progress, as you said, why would you do them? Like just skip through to get to where your goal is. In some ways, I wonder if this game, like it's impossible, right? You need to have the enemies there. I just wonder if there was a way to make, like, can you imagine this game with like Halo combat? Man, that game, it would take forever to get through, but that's all I could think as I was playing this game. It's like Halo 1 did this close to medium range combat against alien enemies just a trillion times better. And
It's because the weapons have nuance. Like, you can use the different weapons against every single enemy in Halo, and it has some effect, right? Like, you can use the thing to knock the shields off, or you can use any of the guns, if you happen to have them, and it'll have a different effect. I feel like in this game, half the time, all the different guns do is damage. Like,
Yep.
sometimes the ice gun freezes them. Sometimes the fire one sets them on fire. Like, the wave half the time doesn't do anything to them. Maybe it stuns them, but it's like
it stuns electrical enemies, so you use it against like robots and turrets.
It's
and
like
stuff.
every enemy will have exactly one weakness, and the other weapons are like pointless against them, I guess.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I'd say take the combat out, because I don't think that would work
I don't
either.
think that's the solution. I think it needs to be better, but I do think that, like, you're better off skipping it in this game. It's just so dull.
The truth is, Castlevania Symphony and I had shitty combat. Super Metroid mostly had shitty combat, although I thought it had pretty good boss fights. Hollow Knight, once again, is the game that stands out as a Metroidvania that has actively good combat. And the way they did it was they made it tight and challenging, like Dark Souls.
I don't think Symphony of the Night's combat was super interesting, but I do think it felt better.
Yeah, there was variety of weapons to use, and there seemed like there were different and magic and Street Fighter combos. And there were different things you could do, right?
But it was very responsive. Like, it was even just fun to, like, jump at an enemy, slash them, and immediately pull back on the stick to, like, hit them from max range constantly. And you can do that in Hollow Knight too. And there's like a joy to, like, getting better at that. I don't think there's headshot hitboxes in this game or anything like that.
No, I don't think so, no.
There's like nothing to, like, you can't, it doesn't feel like you can get better at it, basically. Like, I'm not, even in something like Devil May Cry, it's more fun to, like, if there's literal punching bag enemies that don't even move or attack you, it's more fun to fight those because, you're still getting better at the combos and shit like that.
Well, maybe we've struck on one of the reasons that 3D Metroidvanias are rare. It's hard to make the combat work in every way that it needs to in these games. Because, I don't have an easy solution here. I just know that it wasn't particularly good, but removing it, which is what I've suggested in many other elements with other games, doesn't actually solve the problem either. You need some kind of threat. So it's an interesting thing to think about. But yeah, unfortunately, Metroid Prime sucks at it.
Yeah. Boss fights I wanted to talk about quickly too.
Yeah, of course.
So I actually think that I would split the boss fights into two categories here. The boss fights at the start of the game and the boss fights in the second half of the game. So in the first half of the game, I think the boss fights are pretty, like, standard, like, Nintendo bosses where, you do the thing 3 times, and then in the win, like, after you do the thing, you can do some damage to it. And then the boss will die pretty quickly if you do the thing 3 times quick enough. In the second half of the game, they kind of throw this out the window, and it becomes a bit more like, like a Souls game where it's about pattern recognition and not getting hit for a long period of time. I didn't mind it so much in the first half of the game because the bosses, you could get through them kind of quickly. Most of them looked pretty cool. And they often, basically every boss, there was a reward waiting for you behind them. So that was okay. The second half of the game, I genuinely believe every boss in the second half of the game would be better if you tripled their damage
and halved their health.
Yeah, and halved their health.
Yep, completely agree.
All of them, even though I could dodge every pattern very easily, I couldn't kill them very quickly despite that. So there was a boss late in the game. I think it was like the Omega Pirate, where I literally like paused the game to go get food. Like it just took so long, and I got bored.
That's the one where you have to shoot the 4 points off its 4 limbs, right? And then
Yeah.
it turns invisible. Yeah. The frustrating thing is that like these designs aren't necessarily intrinsically bad. Like the final boss fight in particular, I really like how you have to use the different visors because it becomes invisible to whatever visor you use last, which is a really cool concept.
Yeah,
But
completely agree.
that whole boss fight takes like 25 minutes. I was like, how is this taking so long?
Yeah, it's like no matter how cool the gimmick is, 20 minutes of the same thing over and over and over, you're going to get bored, and then you're going to dislike the boss, even though like the boss looks cool. And I think the last two bosses are really cool design wise. I think they just have too much health, and you have too much health.
And like one of the big things that makes the Souls style or Hollow Knight style boss fights engaging is that you have to identify windows where you can get damage in, but usually they're vulnerable to damage 100% of the time. It's just about figuring out when can I get a swing in without taking damage myself.
Yeah.
And usually there are lots and lots of these windows, and playing around and figuring out where those windows are and how risky you can get in the tightness of those windows is a big part of why those fights are enjoyable. Part of the problem with the design of Metroid Prime's boss fights is the enemies are invulnerable for large portions of these fights. You can only do damage at specific windows, so you do a lot of bored waiting. And like James said, these patterns are not difficult to dodge. So you're basically passively waiting for when you finally get to engage in the boss fight.
Yeah, and I think this issue compounds the weapon system in this game. So you have your normal shot, your charge shot, a missile, and then there's this thing you can do where for each of the weapons, if you charge up the weapon, and then while you're holding the charge, press the missile button, you can do a special move if you've unlocked it. And all of these are basically useless against the bosses, I found. And to me, that's a huge problem because I wasn't going to use them against the enemies that I was skipping. Like, I just think that, and all of these are like optional upgrades. Like, you don't need to find them to finish the game.
They're pretty end game as well. Like,
they're very late. Yeah, you're not getting these until like the last couple of hours, basically. Why don't you just let me destroy the boss with this cool weapon if I want to, right? Like, that would be way more fun.
I agree,
and it doesn't even have to destroy them. It just, it's like, I spend the whole game, because these use your missiles as ammo, like the flamethrower uses your missile count. I spend the whole game collecting like 50 missile upgrades and this hard-to-find flamethrower upgrade, and I literally can't use it against the boss that forces me to just use the normal charge shot against it, wait 10 seconds. It's so boring, right? Like, just let me be overpowered and have fun.
It's funny because these are, I think the frustrating thing about these boss fights is that they're close. Like, they're not actually that far off being enjoyable.
But from being really fun?
Yeah,
I agree.
And it's not, you just have to do a numbers tweak. I love the idea of tripling their damage. I was just going to say halving their health, but I agree that if you could massively increase their damage output, so you die in like 3 or 4 hits to them, and that would
maybe
make
not
for
4 hits, but like more.
Well, it depends on how many
like
energy
50.
tanks you have, right? But let's say you're not getting all the energy tanks. Suddenly, getting those energy tanks is a lot more meaningful as well, right? Because you can go from dying in 4 hits to 5 hits, or 4 hits to 6 hits.
I thought about this a lot today, and I was thinking, rather than adjusting the boss's numbers, what if you just replaced half the energy tanks with generic damage upgrades? Then you have less health and you do more damage, so it's like the same thing.
Yeah,
and
actually, that's a good point.
And it also, like, because one of my problems with the exploration, I've been negative a lot this episode, but I actually did enjoy it quite a lot, was that there's only basically 3 types of rewards. There's the really cool reward of getting the new traversal thing, which is always great. And then there's like getting missiles and energy tanks, which at the start of the game is awesome. And then as the game goes on, they become less and less exciting when you're just like drowning in them. And then it becomes a bit boring. It's like, oh, it's just another missile.
I like the idea of the damage upgrade. The other thing they could have done is have the artifacts give you some kind of passive upgrade in power, but I don't think they do anything.
They do
But
nothing.
you know, when I was like, "Oh, I got the artifact of strength," does this mean my damage is higher? No, it doesn't mean your damage is higher. It doesn't do anything.
It thinks you're strong because you got it.
It would be cool if they did something. I mean, I know that would potentially wreak havoc with the balance, but it would mean that I think the damage upgrade would also mean that you can more easily flow through those areas.
That are boring, because they're spongy enemies. Yeah.
So James, listen, you're right. We have been pretty negative going from gameplay to gameplay, but I think I'd like to talk now about. Well, let's have a music break, and then I want to talk about platforming.
I just wanted to praise
the
second last boss fight. Just because it's got
Ridley.
No. The one there's that, and then there's the two of the same boss in a row at the very end.
The spider version of the fight.
Yeah. I thought that was awesome because there's 8 phases, basically, and it changes every time. I was like, that's cool, even though it has a lot of health. And it could have less health. I thought that made it a lot more tolerable, whereas Ridley, easily my least favorite boss fight in the game. It was like,
it takes so long.
I did the first 80% of his health quite quickly, and then it's the last 20% was actually 3 more health bars.
It's like, please open your goddamn mouth so I can shoot you in the face and get this over with. But he's like, no, I'm not going to open my mouth for a while. I'm like, cool fight.
I got to admit, near the very end, I did figure out what I was doing wrong. It was his charge attack. He actually opens his mouth every single time for a split second. If you I was missing that. Once I figured that out, it was faster. So maybe that's on me.
Yeah, you're an idiot, James. Confirmed.
Yeah.
But listen, I really want to move into the good part of this game because I agree with you, James. We have been negative. I think we're maybe giving the wrong impression here because I definitely didn't hate Metroid Prime. In fact, I quite liked it. But I think the key to understanding that is that this is not a first-person shooter. It's a first-person platformer.
Yeah.
But let's have a music break. The one I'm going to pick is actually the this isn't my favorite track, but I think it makes a nice contrast from the one James picked, and that's the volcanic area. What's it called again, James? Magmore
Caverns.
Yeah, Magmore Caverns. And I think that this is a good distinction because it's a bit more bombastic than those other slower, more atmospheric tracks, but it still fits the atmosphere perfectly. This is a dangerous area. There's all this heavier bass. Some choir tones come in. It's really, really good for that area. And I think that's something that Metroid Prime does really well, having the soundtracks flow from area to area, so you still feel immersed. So here is Magma Caverns.
Alrighty, that was Magmore Caverns, and we can talk a bit about the level design and the platforming and the items, because this is the good part of the game,
Mm.
and quite a substantial part of the game actually. So, where did you want to begin?
Well, I just want to talk a bit about a game feel, I guess, and part of this is mouse and keyboard, but I just want to say straight out, controlling Samus in this game and moving through this game feels great, and
Yep.
every single movement upgrade you get feels even better, and getting new movement upgrades and getting to use them is bloody fantastic. Whether it's the double jump, being able to move through water more effectively, your morph ball, everything, literally every single movement upgrade you get, whenever you get one, I was overjoyed because I had a new toy in my arsenal to play with. The process of moving through these levels and platforming in first person in this game is fucking excellent and should not be understated.
Yeah, I found it to be really enjoyable too. One of my big pet peeves about Super Metroid is that I think the moment to moment feel of controlling the character is quite poor actually.
Hmm.
And that I think when it's something that that is the entire experience of the game, it really soured it for me, even though I agree that the design of that game's incredible. Just if it feels that poor the entire time, really hurts it for me. With this, I had the opposite experience, right? I think that Super Metroid is a better designed game than Metroid Prime in a lot of ways, but this game feels better to control. And we're cheating a bit with mouse and keyboard, but that was my
That's how
experience
I'd
with
play
it.
it
Yeah.
today. So it's
Yeah,
not
and
cheating
that's
at
how I'd
all.
recommend people play it today. It feels really good.
And I think that I want to just bring up my old bugbear with these old 2D platformers. I had this same problem with Mega Man X. It's such a zoomed in perspective. Like you can't. One of the reasons platforming in that game isn't fun is that you can't really see what's coming next. So the platforming challenges have to be very small in scale. In a 3D game where you can turn around and look in any direction, you can have far more expansive and interesting spaces to platform in than is
Yeah.
possible in Super Metroid. So the platforming in this game is way it even does cool things like when you go into the morph ball, it has 2D sections for you to platform through. Like
Yeah, I
that's
love
sweet.
those.
It just changes to 2D for a bit. And I wouldn't describe this platforming as like challenging platforming. There's nothing here that's difficult from a platforming perspective. It just feels fun to smoothly flow through these levels. And every upgrade you get, you're moving smoother and smoother through them and speeding through them faster and faster.
Yeah, and every room is a bit different. I particularly want to call out the spider ball as being like probably my favorite upgrade in one of these games ever. I found every single section that used it to be really fun. So for those who haven't played this one before, the spider ball, despite his name, it actually makes your ball magnetic. So when you turn into the ball, there are these like metal panels over the wall, generally like tracks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you like hold the right click or whatever you've got it bound to, you'll stick. And a lot of them are very vertical, right? Like you'll be rolling sideways along a wall and you'll need to let go of the magnetism so you drop. And then like as you pass past another bit of metal, you need to re-engage it so you stick again. And there's a bunch of stuff like that. And I found it worked really well. It felt good. It was intuitive. And there was this one section in
The one
particular.
room, right,
Yeah.
where it's like a big spider ball platforming
Yes.
bit. Yeah, I can't remember what's at the end of it, but that
The
whole
plasma rifle.
yeah, that whole
Yeah.
section, and then there starts being enemies that are kind of like
That was
getting in
my
your way.
favorite room in the whole game.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair because it's actually a long-term significant challenge, and you can fall off.
It's also my favorite part about that room is that you encounter it very early into the game. But you only when you come back to it at the very end of the game, you actually it like transforms. It's like the room changes completely because of one of your other couple of upgrades, and then this giant like metal maze appears everywhere all over the wall, and it's like so unexpected because you've traveled through this room like 30 times and you didn't know any of this was here. It's fucking awesome when that happens. I loved that. really fun.
I think one of my favorite upgrades was getting the gravity suit, because one of the cool things it does is when you first go underwater, you're very sluggish and slow. You jump kind of slow and can't jump very high. And I think most interestingly, your vision in the water is
It's
absolute shit.
terrible.
You can't see
Yeah.
anything. You get the gravity suit, and all of a sudden, platforming underwater is exactly the same as platforming on land, and it feels fantastic. All these areas which were like cut off to you completely before, which were like, it's like, oh fuck, another water section, suddenly become a lot of fun to get through. And it's almost hilarious how areas that were difficult for you to get through before are now just a complete breeze to slide through.
I feel like they should have called it the scuba suit. Like, it has no impact out of the water.
I know, but I guess it's always called the gravity suit, and they have to use all the same names.
Yeah.
How did you feel about the morph ball? Because I think that thing is like, I'm shocked at how good they got that to feel. Like, it's just right. Like, the gravity and the reactivity of that thing is just perfect. It's very speedy. I did struggle a bit with the boost going up half pipes, but after enough
Yeah, it
practice, I was
a bit
able to do
janky.
it. Yeah, I figured that you have to boost on the lower part of the ramp. Like, you
Yeah,
can't
the
boost as
very
you're
low
going
point.
up. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you can't boost as you're falling down the ramp.
No.
It has to be at the low point.
It has to be at the lowest point of the ramp.
But
Yeah,
you
it's a
can
bit
boost
weird.
anytime, so you can just use it to just speed through a room, which was quite funny. I did that a
Quite
few
funny.
times.
I did
Yeah.
that a lot as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I actually think the game would be better for is that a lot of the doors are locked behind specific weapons. So, like, some
Mhm.
doors will glow blue and you can shoot it with any weapon to open them. Some will glow red and you need the fire weapon to open the door. I reckon, and then like the blue doors you can actually open with morph ball bombs. I don't know if you noticed that.
I didn't know.
No, but you can. I reckon if the first time you open a door, it turned into a blue door, so you didn't need to get the other weapon out, then you could just like stay in morph ball mode and bomb through every door and zoom through the levels really quick.
Yeah,
I feel like that would have been fun.
That would unfortunately probably break the levels in half, because the game needs loading screens, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
time to unfortunately switch back to negativity mode. I think that the level design on a micro level is actually really good in this game.
Yep.
Part of what makes the movement through these levels fun is that the levels are designed well. So using your movement abilities to get through them is a lot of fun.
Patrick's negative take. This is fun and I hate it.
No. As much as I agree with the concept that I hate fun, we're still getting there. The way that the macro level design of Metroid Prime works is completely arse, and there's a couple of reasons for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We always praise looping level design and that kind of thing. And definitely out of all the games that I've played that do this kind of thing, I think this does it the least convincingly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the root of this issue is that when they were making Metroid Prime, they didn't seek to make a 3D Metroidvania in and of itself. They sought to turn Super Metroid, specifically Super Metroid, into a 3D game.
Yeah.
In some ways, that works brilliantly. For example,
they succeeded.
Well, they did, yeah. The thing that really stands out is, I swear to God, the pacing that you receive power-ups is like identical to Super Metroid. And I love the pacing of the power-ups in Super Metroid. Like, it really does throw them at you at a regular interval, and it seems to do it just at the right time when you're growing bored. Where it doesn't work is in the transition of 2D level design, which is on a flat plane, to 3D level design, because 2D level design of Super Metroid is a lot of rooms and corridors. And if you turn a 2D space of rooms and corridors into a 3D space, it just becomes a bit shitty and unbelievable as a cohesive 3D space.
It's very hard to keep the level structure in your head. Like, my spatial awareness in this game, like, I felt like I was going senile. Like, it was so hard for me to remember where everything was in relation to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the root of this problem is the corridors. Like, something like Dark Souls is a continuous open world, and I can remember where everything is, like, perfectly. And maybe part of that is that I've played that game a lot, but in Super Metroid, because everything is very segmented by doors and magic teleporting elevators that don't like logically flow together.
I
I
don't know how
can't.
this world fits together.
Yeah, I have
And
no idea.
we have just played this game for 10, 15 hours, however long it took, and I could not tell you how this world fits
Yeah,
together in any kind of logical structure.
me neither.
Which is insane, right? Like, let me put it this way to you, James. You're on record as hating System Shock 1. Do you think
Yes.
System Shock 1's world and level design makes more sense, is like more reasonable to navigate than Metroid
Well,
Prime?
it's just a skyscraper with an elevator floating in
Yeah.
space,
And
right?
the thing that's crazy is that System Shock 1, it's not like it has crazy unique areas. In fact, I remember, the whole Arboretum section and how there were the 4 Arboretums. Like, I remember that area being a little lost and confused. But that area makes more sense to me than Metroid Prime's world, which is just a bunch of nonsensical rooms and corridors stuck together.
Yeah, I think the floors above that one were a bit hard for me in System Shock. But like I agree with you basically. It's like I don't have a clear understanding of a cohesive, like unified world in this game basically because there are shortcuts between the areas, right? You find
Hmm.
elevators that I describe them as Dark Souls 2 elevators, right? Like they just take you to somewhere and there's no right, like it doesn't make any sense how it takes you to this place. I don't think these areas geographically are actually located up and down of each other.
It
In
would be
fact,
interesting to see someone build a map of it. Because maybe it does. It's just impossible to grasp while playing the
if you
game.
open up the map, you can zoom out to the macro map, and the macro map, it's not stacked on top of each other,
No.
and the elevators don't link up to each other vertically. It's like they're all horizontally next to each other, and these up and down elevators move you horizontal. It's very weird. And even in stuff like the Phazon mines later on, which is very vertical, man, I pulled out the map a lot in this game and was like, where the hell do I go? How do I get to this point? I can't remember, even though I've been through these corridors like a dozen times.
Yeah, so I think that when you do this kind of 3D level design, the other thing that this game lacks is quick travel, teleportation of some kind.
The
Like,
elevators.
well, like fast travel between like save points, for example. Castlevania Symphony of the Night lets you walk between save points. Hollow Knight has its stag travel system where you can't go anywhere you want, but the extremities of the map are all linked. Like there's 15 different points that
I
you can
don't
go to.
think that's any different to the elevators in Metroid
Well,
Prime.
well, the difference is the elevators take you between 2 locations, whereas a teleport would let you
Right,
go
okay.
from one location to any other location.
To be fair, there are often a bunch of junctions where there's like 2 or 3 elevators in close proximity. So it's like,
Kind of.
I found in general as I was progressing and I naturally unlocked shortcuts, the shortcuts, were thoughtfully there so that I could save time.
Hmm.
I don't think it's perfect. I think it could be done much better, but I wouldn't call it bad. Other than the very end of the game with the artifact hunt, I wouldn't say the backtracking was super egregious until then.
Let's talk a bit about that, actually.
Well, let's introduce this again.
Okay, sure. At the beginning of the game, I said that your goal is to find the 12 artifacts, but truth be told, for like the first 3 quarters of the game, that's not really true. You're not actively hunting the artifacts in that stage of the game. What you're doing is going where your abilities allow you to go. And the
Yep.
game does push you every time, and it does it very quickly, actually. Let's talk about that, actually. The game will say, oh, there were energy readings in this section. It's kind of telling you this is where you need to go next to get your next big proper upgrade to unlock it.
That's a feature added in the trilogy to make the game easier. You can turn that off in the options, and I
Oh,
turned it
really?
off.
You turned it off. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't hate this. Like, because it doesn't. Usually, the area it's highlighting isn't somewhere you can actually reach. So it's kind of just saying this
It's like
if
a
you
hint.
yeah, if you want to go to the critical path, you need to start looking for areas you can now access in this area. So I actually was a fan of this. I thought it was a good way to push you in the right area without you, going down the wrong path 30 times. So I was a fan of this. You didn't find it necessary though, because clearly you played without it.
No, I didn't. I did have to look up like where one or two of the artifacts was at the end of the game. I just couldn't find them, even with the hints. But for me, a lot of the joy in these games is like keeping track of this mental list of places you need to come back to later. So
Mhm.
I felt that, for me, that kind of takes away from the funnest part of the game. So I just turned it off immediately. I only saw it once. So
Okay.
from the sounds of it, it doesn't sound like it solved the game for you, which,
No, it just sometimes it's like, oh, I have the ice beam. There.
yeah,
I remember seeing 15 ice stores. I could just do them one at a time, but then it's like, oh, this is there's a thing over here. So I'm like, okay, so I'm going to go to Magmore Caverns because I know that that's the next thing and look for ice stores in that area. And I think
yeah.
that kind of push is actually, I'm on board with that because it's not stopping me from going to the other areas. It's just saying this is where your next big upgrade is.
Hmm.
Okay, so moving on to the artifact hunting itself. So at first, my initial instinct was I'm not really a fan of this, and I used a walkthrough to find several of these because I've got a podcast to complete and stuff, and I was like, I can't just amble around in this world for hours and hours and hours. But then I thought, James, this is actually quite a cool way to get you to revisit areas where there were upgrades that you previously couldn't access.
Yeah.
So instead of you just having to freeform explore to get your various power ups, the missile upgrades and the energy tanks, with the artifacts scattered to the winds, if you just naturally go after all the artifacts, you're going to claim and see. It's like, oh, here's an area where I can melt with my heat beam. Oh, there's a
Yeah.
grappling hook here. So I'm now, after thinking about it and thinking about how it works with that structure of collecting all the bits and pieces, it's actually pretty good. It's a good way to power you up before you move into the final confrontation.
So I agree with that.
Hmm.
I think this comes back to the problem of the macro level design, however.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the good, macro level design does is that like, if you think about Dark Souls 1 and like Firelink Shrine and how every level kind of like wraps around Firelink Shrine and it's all kind of like compact. Like you can see Tomb of Giants from like so many places in the map, right?
Hmm.
I don't think Metroid Prime is like that. I think it's a lot more spread out, and there are a lot of areas that have extremities that are really far away from everything else, which A hurts the backtracking because, like Magmore Caverns, for example, I think it's a problem that the entire level is just one long, thin line, and several times you basically have to walk half the length of it to get anywhere.
Hmm.
Whereas if it was like circular, more compact with little shortcuts, you save a lot of time in traversing. That makes the shortcuts to other areas easier to add. But with the artifacts specifically, and I mean specifically with like Fenandra Drifts, like there's an artifact like all the way, in the middle of nowhere near nothing else. And then there's this other artifact all the way on the other side of the map, which is also near nothing else.
Mm.
This kind of backtracking is really annoying. If those areas were curved inwards and could be accessed from the other parts of the map more easily, I would have found this process of going to find them all way less tedious. It's the ones that were out in the middle of nowhere or like deep in the Phazon mines, stuff like that, that are just a pain in the ass. And I think the whole game and this whole process is more fun if it's quicker to get places with shortcuts and, more clever macro design.
I think that, yeah, Dark Souls, once again, when you know how the map of Dark Souls fits together, you can get from anywhere to anywhere in minutes. Like it's laughable how you can get from Firelink Shrine to the church if you go the back path through, the tower where Havel is, and then up Darkroot Garden path and everything. Like you can get to the blacksmith in literally 2 minutes of sprinting from Firelink Shrine. Maybe a bit longer than that, but is pretty damn quick. This game, man, I don't know. I could never easily be like, I'm here, I want to get to here. How the fuck do I do it? I just couldn't figure it out. It was like 2 minutes of staring at the map and then repeatedly bringing up my map again and again and again. I couldn't just, you know, be like, all right, I'm going from here to here and then just flow through.
Yeah.
Even after I'd gone through these areas multiple times, because it just wasn't very memorable how it all fit together.
So I want to go back to the tutorial again, and I know I hammered on it a bit at the start for the scan points, but I do want to bring up the idea that in the tutorial, you actually have most of your abilities, including the grapple beam, which you don't get until like the last couple of hours again. So you do the tutorial with all your abilities, and then you lose your abilities, and then you're on the world. So to me, the fun part of Metroid is A, exploration, like B, finding new abilities, and C, the fact that the game doesn't hold your hand. Like, it's up to you to find your way, and it doesn't tell you where to go. The tutorial in this game has none of those things. It's a hand-holdy corridor. B, you're not getting anything because you already have all your upgrades. And C, there's no explanation. You know, it's a corridor again. So I think that every single time I started and dropped this game was because the tutorial's like it is, and I hate it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
After the tutorial, once you lose all your abilities, you find abilities very quickly. Like, there is such a density of upgrades at the beginning.
Just like Super Metroid.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's like every couple of rooms you get something new, which opens up new possibilities. There's doors everywhere. You like, your to-do list of places to go is like spiraling out of control, right?
You have stuff happen like you get that spider ball boost upgrade, and then you're like, oh, I remember all of those half pipes I saw. It's like suddenly you're like, I want to go back there and get the thing. Like you actively do.
Yeah. And at this point in the game, and this to me is the best part of the whole game, is this bit in the middle. It doesn't actually matter that the macro design sucks, because there's so many options for you to go that if you just pick a direction, you'll find something new.
Mm-hmm.
You don't actually need to look at the map. It's near the end where there's like 3 doors that you haven't explored, and you forget where those 3 doors are, and you have to find those 3 specific doors where it becomes a problem. But in the middle, none of that actually matters, because you just go in a direction you haven't gone before, and there's heaps of stuff to find and explore. It's awesome.
And this is compounded by the fact in the in-game that the rewards you're finding are less meaningful. So, yes, you do all this stuff, and then you go from 180 missiles to 185 missiles. And you're like, well, was that really worth it?
Well, at the start of the game, you have like 5 or 10 missiles.
So go from 10 to 15. Now we're talking. Like
there's like a 50% upgrade. That's insane. It's nuts. And then your first energy pack is you've doubled your health. It's like, holy shit. And then at the end of the game, you've got 8 health bars, and you find the 9th one, and it's like, oh, whatever.
And while it's fine to move, and while it's enjoyable to move around these levels, it's still not enjoyable to fight the enemies or, you know.
And at this point, you've gone through every area like 20 times, right?
So basically,
to wear off.
Yeah, I think a lot of the macro design here is, but
more of a problem near the end of the game.
But as a first-person platformer, this game is very fun, and that's the difficult part. I kind of feel a bit bad, James, because
I had this problem while I was writing my notes, where I was like, I really like this game, but literally, like, I have 6 pages of negativity, and I don't know how I can reconcile how much I like this game with. Like, when I analyze it, I'm like, man, this is all terrible, but it's really fun.
And the answer is, game feel, which kind of feels like a cop-out excuse. But the thing is, controlling Samus and moving through the world, the moment-to-moment gameplay of platforming through the world, and the excitement and enjoyment you get with these new upgrades, and the diversity in platforming, and
the atmosphere.
It's one thing we haven't really talked much about is the puzzles, in inverted commas. The way I view these puzzles is that they're not puzzles, and you don't get enjoyment out of them because you'll give your brain a workover. You enjoy them because they add a little bit of a tweak to the nature of the platforming. It's like, oh, here's a bit where I have to blow up a bomb, and then I'm on a timer to reach this other bit.
Yeah.
Oh, I need to move this spider track by rotating this big column, and depending on what angle it's at, I can access different
I was
areas.
reading through like people's like online their opinion on Metroid. I kept seeing only negativity about this column with the colored tracks that you had to rotate, and I was like,
People are idiots, James.
yeah,
My
I was
God.
like, that was so fun. That was like one of the best bits.
So it's also worth noting, and we haven't really said this, the platforming, it constantly changes it up just a little bit to give you new kind of like tweaks on how you're using those abilities. For example, with the grapple beam, eventually there's a creature that you can grapple beam off. So it's not just static grapple beam points. You just throw in a few of those, and suddenly the experience of moving through the world becomes a bit more varied and interesting as you're moving through. And you got to give a lot of respect to the game for not having it just be 100% static grapple points, or 100% you're using this, the speed ball only on half pipes and that's it. No, you can also jump in a machine to rapidly spin something to lower a lever. These are all little things, but it all just adds it just adds enough to keep this platforming engaging and varied and interesting.
One of my favorite bits was getting the X-ray visor and then noticing that there were actually invisible platforms hidden in the environment that I could have been jumping on this whole time, and then noticing that, like, oh yeah, I guess if I shoot in that spot, it does hit it and the bullet disappears. It's like, I wonder if I could have actually figured that out myself. Maybe if it was like raining or something. But yeah, it is all moment to moment feel and atmosphere, right?
Which is fine. Like, you can't. And honestly, this shit's really important to me. I'm always banging on about moment to moment gameplay. But I guess you just have to take our broader criticisms of the structure hand in hand with the fact that the game is fun to play. Do you have any more notes, James? It feels like we're kind of moving on to final impressions.
So I did actually want to bring highlight to the sunken wreckage as being very close to my favorite part of the game, not, just for atmosphere, but that moment in that big open room where you drop down and the music starts playing and you're like slowly floating through the wreckage. That was like 10 out of 10 atmosphere. I fucking loved that area. And then you bring up your your infrared goggles and like you have to light up all these bits, and suddenly the room is filled with all this color and these like digital lines going everywhere. That section like looked fantastic and sounded fantastic, and I was like, in that part of the game I was like, man, I fucking love this game. Like, even with all of the other issues I have with the combat and whatever, there is some real soul here,
Yeah, I also really liked that section at first, but it soured on me, James, and I think why. Because the problem with this section is there's this puzzle it does where you get to the door has no power, and you have to find some power conduits with your X-ray vision to turn the power on to open the door. It's like, okay, I'll do this. And then I did it in the next room, and then I did in the next room, and I did this same puzzle literally, I'm not even exaggerating, 8 times in a row it does this. And usually what happens is you platform to the top of the room, it tells you that the door has no power, and the power conduits are at the bottom of the room. So after platforming to the top, you have to go to the bottom and then platform to the top again. And I was like, really, you just did this same thing 8 times in a row. This is not fun. You're killing the atmosphere, man.
I have a question. Did you get to that section first after you got the gravity suit or before?
I had the gravity suit first. So it was quite funny because you end up on this bit overlooking the frigate. And I was like, oh, I can jump down, but I fell off and I fell into the main river and I couldn't figure out how to get back, and I didn't want to backtrack all the way. So I then found the gravity suit and then came back later.
Oh, okay. Because what I did was...
Can you do it without the gravity suit? That seems impossible.
Okay, so if you go to where your ship is, you can find the little, like, there's like the little hole. Like if you look at your map, you're like, oh, there's a path there, and you're like, oh, it's behind this like wall, and then you go down there, and
Yeah.
then you find the water, and
Yep.
then you have to do some janky platforming to get up there. And I was like, oh, you need the ice beam, and then I came back later when I had the ice beam, but it was before the gravity suit,
Right.
and you can get. So there's that first big room. You can get through that door and through the next room, and then there's a bit where there is a jump that's like impossible to get up. So
Right.
I had to backtrack out like 4 rooms and then come back later and do that section again. So yeah, I really wish I had waited.
Yeah, no,
Let's just say
it was
that.
much better with the gravity suit, but yeah, I could have gone in there, but I fell off. So, final impressions, James?
Yeah, sure. I have a lot of negative things to say about Metroid Prime. I think that the macro level design is some of the worst I've seen in this kind of game. I think that the enemies are some of the most unengaging, dull fights in any of these games that I've ever played. I think that the bosses have way too much HP and do too little damage to the player. And despite all of that, I actually found myself constantly, what I normally do is that I schedule like an hour and a half after work every day to play these games, whether or not I enjoy them. And oftentimes, during the last couple of weeks, I would finish my, 90-minute session and then just keep playing more because I was having fun. And that's always, to me, the mark of a game I'm enjoying. Now, that kind of ended once I got to the phazon mines and the enemies became super tanky and the traversal started becoming a bit tedious. But that middle section of Metroid Prime, where there is such a density of upgrades and cool stuff to find and branching paths, you can just, go one way for quite a long time and then, explore in a different direction. That was pure bliss, right? Like it feels really nice to control. The music's incredible. The atmosphere is just fantastic. I see people online mentioning this, feeling of isolation and loneliness. Metroid Prime definitely captures that, just like Super did. And during that middle, that early mid to mid late game period of the game, I was having such a good time. At the end of the game, not so much. I think it becomes a bit tedious. There is a gauntlet of bosses at the end, and with how I feel about the bosses, it kind of like puts a bit of a dampener on the end of the game. But on the whole, I really enjoyed it. It's not without its flaws. It has a lot of them, but I think that for the most part, it doesn't actually matter too much until you get to the end of the game, where all of those flaws get magnified tenfold. So, would I recommend Metroid Prime? Yeah, I think I would. I think I would recommend this one. I would tell people if it doesn't click with you for the first hour, push yourself to keep going because it does get much better. As I, who quit 3 times previously, found out. And I would say once you get the plasma beam, if you are not having fun anytime after that, just feel free to stop because it doesn't get better. It is that early mid to mid late game that is like really, really good. And then the bits before and after, not so much.
I recommend Metroid Prime, and that may seem surprising after we've spent so much time ragging it, but the core part of this being an exploratory platformer is that it's a lot of fun. It is fun to play this game. It's fun to get movement upgrades. It's fun to use those movement upgrades. The ways the puzzles sync with these movement upgrades is fantastic to give it a lot of variety. A lot of the problems with Metroid Prime are structural. They made a 3D Metroid game without fully contemplating what the ramifications of a 3D design space would be. And because of that, a lot of the problems it has suffers from it being a rooms and corridors game. I think that the like James, I think the combat in this game is garbage. I think that the bosses, James's suggestion to decrease health and increase damage would have done a lot to fix it. Just a simple numbers change. But when I think back of Metroid Prime, I don't think about the forgettable combat or, moving through empty corridors. I think of going through that Chozo temple and reading the lore on the various screens. I think of going through that research station and learning about all what the pirates are up to. I think of, speed morph balling my way through areas. This is a fun game. Like there's no other way to say it. It's fun to play in the moment to moment, even if it's filled with a lot of frustration with how you have to fight things, how you have to wait in corridors, and how close to impossible it is to navigate this overworld. And those two things are fairly equal level, even if we did spend more time tonight speaking about those bigger structural issues, just because it's easier to and more interesting to talk about them than saying, man, this game feels fun to play. So play Metroid Prime, enjoy it. I think that it's worth pushing through its bigger problems for the joy of the moment to moment.
Yeah. Very interesting to talk about at the very least.
Yeah, interesting game. I'd also throw out a recommendation once again for Supraland if you enjoyed Metroid Prime. More than anything, playing through this game reminded me of Supraland and how you gain various movement upgrades. The main difference is Supraland is far more heavy puzzle focus, but those puzzles aren't crazy hard. It's more about using your cool movement abilities in combination with one another in really sweet ways. So that's a game, if you've enjoyed Metroid Prime and played it before, that you should definitely check out, because you'll probably get a lot of enjoyment out of it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think that just about wraps up. Thank you so much for being with us here today and listening to us talking all about Metroid Prime. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I was joined by James Turlings. We're the Retrospectives podcast. You can find all of our content on our website, which is rspodcast.net. Has links to all of our episodes, in addition, a bunch of articles that we've written. Most importantly, it has our Discord server. Our Discord server is where we do all of our interaction with our community, where we take game recommendations, where we shoot the shit about video games, and where we agree to never do a JRPG ever again, right, James?
There's got to be one on the cards next year.
Please, if we can avoid, if we do a JRPG, James, we're doing another Boomer Shooter or System Shock 2, and I think we can do that as a fair and equitable trade of games that the other will hate.
Supposed to do that this year.
We were, yeah, but this next year is going to be all the better for us. So next episode, this was episode 99, so obviously we have episode 100 coming up next, right, James?
Well, see, we were always talking about doing Pathologic 2 for episode 100, but I'm thinking if we don't do the mailbag and, various topics next one, then we're going to be pushing like February before we get to that one. So we're going to be a bit cheaty and probably do like an episode 99.5 or something.
Sounds good to me. Let's cheat. Because honest to God, the mailbag episodes we do where we take questions from our Discord listeners, some of my favorite episodes every single year, because we get to talk so much about modern games random topics that I feel are still relevant to the way that we talk about video games, but we get to kind of go outside of our wheelhouse a little bit. And I think the questions we get every year are fucking fantastic. Like they're not just like random shitty questions. They're questions that people have put a lot of thought into. So I'm very excited.
Yeah, and I've had a look at the ones because we've got a few piling up now in the mailbag channel on Discord. And basically all great questions already. We're going to be asking every single one of those. So if anyone has any more, feel free to drop by on Discord or just send
Twitter.
us a tweet.
Twitter is fine as well. We'll take them from there. But Discord is definitely the best place to do it. So if you're enjoying the show, we would really love if you would drop by our Discord. It's just the best place to be to engage with us as podcast creators. So please drop by, ask a question. We'd love to answer anything.
Yeah, I'll tell Patrick or myself we have shit taste.
that is also part of the discussion. But but you'll have to defend your taste as well. So we'll see about that. Alrighty, so that wraps up episode 99 of Metroid Prime. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next episode for the mailbag number 4.
See you then, guys.